right, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the second of our two Jazz Matters panel discussions for 2009, presented by the Jazz Journalists Association. And today we're going to focus on a single year, 1959, and the incredible output that year represented in jazz. The short list of landmark recordings and performances is nothing short of remarkable. John Coltrane's Giant Steps, Charles Mingus's Mingus Aum, Dave Brubeck's Time Out, Thelonious Monk at Town Hall, Ornette Coleman at the 5 Spot, and of course Miles Davis's Kind of Blue, which we were listening to as you came in. So over the course of the next hour, we're gonna touch on some others as well, some other performances and recordings, and try to understand what was in the air culturally 50 years ago. So let me introduce our panel for today. They are well equipped to discuss today's topic. Charlie Gordon. For 40 years, Charlie Gordon was known as one of Canada's finest journalists. His columns in Maclean's magazine, his books and wry commentary in the Ottawa Citizen marked him as one of the country's most skilled humorists. Who knew that he had a secret life? As a young man, the trumpet vied with the typewriter for Charlie's attention. Journalism won out as a career choice, but Charlie has returned to jazz in recent years, and he now leads his own band and plays in several others. Ashley Kahn, for those of you who were here yesterday, know that Ashley Kahn is most prominently, germane to today's topic, is the author of Kind of Blue, the making of the Miles Davis masterpiece. He's also written 3 other books, including a history of Blue Note Records that will be published shortly. He's been awarded the ASCAP Deems Taylor Prize for Music Writing twice, and he's been nominated for a Grammy Award. He currently teaches music history and criticism at New York University's Tisch School of the Arts. I'm not sure whether it was me who first called Mark Miller the Dean of Canadian Jazz Journalism, but the title certainly fits, and I'm going to take credit for it. Mark was the Globe and Mail's jazz critic for 27 years, contributing more than 4,000 reviews, feature articles, and photographs. In 2007, Mark was nominated for the Jazz Journalists Association's Lifetime Achievement Award, but he continues to achieve. His new book, a biography of pianist-composer Herbie Nichols, will be published this fall. Alan Stanbridge is an assistant professor in visual and performing arts and arts management at the University of Toronto, with a cross-appointment to the university's Faculty of Music and Museum Studies program. He's published extensively on popular music, jazz history, cultural policy, and theory, and he's currently working on his first book, which is going to be called Rhythm Changes, The Discourses of Jazz. Jesse Stewart is a faculty member in the School of Art and Culture at Carleton University. He's had a diverse career as a percussionist, composer, an instrument builder, and a visual artist. As a drummer, he's played with a wide range of musicians, including George Lewis, Roswell Rudd, William Parker, Bill Dixon, and Dominic Duval. He also has a couple bands that he's a member of, including baritone saxophonist David Mott's Quintet, and a trio called Tall Boys with the brilliant guitarist Kevin Bright and the equally brilliant cellist Matt Brubeck. Oh, there's that name again, Brubeck. We'll get back to that. Ron Sweetman. I don't know if there's anything in jazz that Ron Sweetman hasn't done short of performing, but he may be holding out on me in that area as well. Ron has been an advocate for creative music since he was a young man in England, and since moving to Ottawa in the 70s, he has become a fixture on the local jazz scene as the host of In a Mellow Tone on CKCU-FM, one of the founders of Jazz Ottawa, and the driving force behind Music Now, which has brought the ICP Orchestra, among others, to Ottawa. He's also had a long career in music journalism, and in 1959, he was the Paris-based correspondent for New Musical Express. So that is our panel for today, and as I said yesterday, as we go along, if you have questions, feel free to wave your hand. I'll try to see you through the bright lights, and we'll get those into the mix rather than wait till the end, although we will take questions at the end as well. So I'm going to ask Mark Miller to sort of sketch out the groundwork for this, the wonder year, 1959.
Thank you, James. And the Dean of Canadian Jazz is yours. I'm in the process of registering it for copyright.
Just like Billy Joel.
That's it. I spent some time last week going through Downbeat for 1959, thinking, of course, that inasmuch as James, Ron, and I have all been correspondents with that magazine at one time or another, its editorial authority must be unimpeachable, right? Downbeat came out twice a month in 1959. Those were the days. But despite its immediacy, I didn't get a sense that from the magazine's choice of stories that anything special was happening that year, the year that so excites us now. The coverage was decidedly mainstream, with features on Red Nichols, Meade Lux Lewis, and the Dukes of Dixieland on one hand, and Kenny Dorham, Shelley Mann, and Cannonball Adderley on the other. There was a photo shoot from an Ornette Coleman recording session and a report, more than a review, of his opening night at the Five Spot, but apparently no one was quite ready to deal directly with the music itself. Billie Holiday, Lester Young, and Sidney Bechet all died in 1959. Closer to home, George Wein mounted what he called the first Canadian Jazz Festival in Toronto. The lineup, in retrospect, was amazing. The trumpeters alone: Louis Armstrong, Miles Davis, Dizzy Gillespie, Roy Eldridge, Lee Morgan, Maynard Ferguson, Buck Clayton, and Ruby Braff. But the event was a bust at the box office, and the first Canadian Jazz Festival was also the last. Good old Toronto. Naturally, Downbeat reviewed the various recordings that we're celebrating here today. Kind of Blue, Giant Steps, and Mingus all received 5 stars, 5 out of 5. The Thelonious Monk Orchestra at Town Hall was given 4.5. The half-star docked for sloppy execution. Ornette's The Shape of Jazz to Come received 4 stars. His Tomorrow is the Question, 3. Poor Dave Brubeck was awarded only 2 for Time Out. We have the benefit of hindsight as we make our own assessments of these albums. In some cases, their impact on jazz was delayed. Time Out, for example. In other cases, the recordings that followed by these same artists put these particular releases in context, and I'm thinking of Giant Steps. I'm inclined to see them as variously significant. Kind of Blue, the Coleman LPs, and Time Out pointed jazz in directions that it had not taken before, and for that reason seemed to me to be the most important of these releases, beyond the obvious measure of the popularity of Kind of Blue and Time Out. Kind of Blue and the Coleman recordings were each, in their way, addressing linearity in jazz. Linearity in relation to and ultimately independent of conventional harmony, an important development in and of itself and a step toward the free improvisation of the avant-garde. Time Out, as its title suggests, explored time signatures that were outside of the common 4 to the bar and lately 3 to the bar of jazz to that point. A very early portent of the asymmetric fluency that is second nature among young musicians today. Mingus and Monk's Town Hall session are, to me, something else. Fine recordings by Mingus and Monk, to be sure, but ones that sit in sequence with what they were doing in 1958 and 1960. And then there's Giant Steps. When we talk about Giant Steps, we usually talk about the tune Giant Steps, which strikes me as the culmination of Coltrane's period as a change-running hard bopper. He's closing a door here, even as he has opened a window nearby with the modal quality of some of the other pieces on the album. The complex structural challenges of Giant Steps, harmonically, anticipated developments in post-bop, and even what Dave Holland, for example, has done rhythmically in more recent years. You know, the notion of exploring the possibilities of impossibility. But Coltrane himself was moving away from that challenge, which makes Giant Steps, the album, an important document in his development, but a more broadly ambiguous recording in ways that Kind of Blue and The Shape of Jazz to Come are not. And I have to wonder whether the fact that all of these recordings were made in 1959 was no more than a coincidence, that there really wasn't something in the air or the water. Miles, Ornette, and Brubeck certainly weren't musical confidants, sharing notes and trying to outdo each other. Miles and Coltrane, maybe. But really, they were all moving on their own divergent paths, as were Mingus and Monk. And I wonder, too, perhaps more provocatively, if we here today aren't playing into some music industry agenda simply to sell records in 2009, when we agree to the imposition of an arbitrary January to December set of brackets on what was in fact a longer, very fluid, and highly creative period in the history of jazz. Couldn't we reconvene this panel next June and talk with just as much good reason musically about Sketches of Spain, Ornette's Free Jazz, Joe Harriot's Free Form, Charles Mingus Presents Charles Mingus, Gil Heaven's Out of the Cool, and Max Roach's We insist. Freedom Now Suite. I think we could. James?
Thanks, Mark. Ashley, I know you've done quite a bit of background research in about 1959 about other streams of music that were swirling around, particularly in New York City. Maybe you can sort of sketch that out outside of these recordings that we're talking about.
Sure, I'd be happy to. One thing that I've found in my research for Kind of Blue that I found very interesting that I think applies to this is, in a general sort of way, is Miles did this interview in 1986 with Ben Sidran, the piano player and radio host in the States, who's based out of Madison, Wisconsin. Ben's interviews with musicians are great because he's a musician himself, and he's able to penetrate into levels that I think a lot of journalists and academics do not. And they're talking about Kind of Blue, and Miles says, the general question is, how did you come to this modal idea? And you're credited for being the guy who really broke modal jazz. And he kind of dismisses that, and he said, it's like drawing in circles, and I think he's referring, of course, to the Guggenheim and the whole idea of Frank Lloyd Wright and the idea that, and I'm paraphrasing here, but it's basically, he said, one guy starts drawing with circles, but everybody's doing it at the same time or has the idea. So it's much more of a shared collective thing. And I think that's really one way you can take that, from modal jazz and really apply it to creative energy in general. And I think that on an individual or a collective level, that creative, experimental spirit does not move at a steady rate. But there are those times and places. In this case, we're talking mostly New York, 1959, when everything is changing. And the sort of inside view, which is not what you asked for, but I'll give that real fast, I think is simply that, bebop had been around for about 15 years by then. Bebop had really made its mark for 15 years by 1959. And the idea that what was once revolutionary had become a set of rules, a set of cliches, what Miles called the music was getting crowded, as he said in one interview with Nat Hentoff around that time in 1958. The idea is that change was necessary, and what to do with this bebop language, with this vocabulary that had been set in motion 15 years before, the various responses that we now know as these best-selling jazz albums, Time Out, Kind of Blue, Giant Steps, are the various ways that different great musical individuals came up with to deal with that, that question. Now, the outside view, 1959 literally is the end of the decade. It's the end of a very buttoned-down decade. It's the decade, the full decade, first full decade after World War II. The economy in the U.S. is doing great. The politics are probably as conservative as they had ever been, except for the past 8 years, and unfortunately. But and there's this itch, this collective itch amongst I think Americans to reach out to the edge, to reach out to the margins, to find. To what's now called keeping it real, trying to find artistic and creative statements in various artistic endeavors, whether it's music or theater or visual art, literature. That's the era of the Beats. It's the era of Jackson Pollock and abstract expressionism. It's the era of Marlon Brando and that type of theatrical realism. And then in music, there's this reaching out to various musical styles such as folk. And folk, the huge folk explosion begins to happen towards the end of the 50s. But there's nothing that approaches both the elegance, the hipness, and the sort of outsider hipness and elegance of jazz. And so, I just reached into one of those Billboard top LPs books, that a gentleman named Joel Woodburn puts together. They're considered the Bible in music research. And the top albums in 1959 includes Henry Mancini's Music from Peter Gunn, which was considered a jazz album, and you have the Kingston Trio with the Kingston Trio at Large and Johnny Mathis's Heavenly. And of course, he was also looked upon as a jazz singer. So, I think that sort of paints the picture that you're asking for there.
I think the other thing is worth mentioning is to try to transport yourself back to New York City in 1959. What was going on in the city outside of music? The Guggenheim Museum opened that year on the Upper East Side. The Museum of Modern Art reopened after having been closed for renovations for quite some time. Broadway was at its peak with West Side Story and other iconic plays and musicals coming on the scene. Ashley already mentioned the Beat Poets. Were at their peak. Obviously, method acting was, after the death of James Dean, with the rise of Marlon Brando and the beginning of people like Paul Newman, was really hot in New York. I mean, it was just such a vibrant time. And Charlie Gordon is not just on our panel today because he's a trumpet player, but in 1959 he was going to Queen's University, but his parents were still living outside of New York City, where Charlie grew up, and so Charlie actually got to go to Manhattan as a late teen budding trumpeter, and saw a lot of these things fomenting in the clubs in New York City, including Ornette at the Five Spot. So Charlie, give us an idea, just sketch of what was going on in jazz in Manhattan in '59.
Well, one very important cultural aspect of '59 that we haven't talked about yet was that the drinking age in New York was 18.
Hooray.
And the drinking age in Ontario was 21. So it was a good time to be in New York, and I was 18. And that meant that I could go to all these clubs. An interesting thing, kind of going back to what Ashley was just saying about bebop language and people trying to shed it or move beyond it. I was 18. I was just starting to play modern jazz trumpet, and of course I was trying to learn bebop language, right? I was in the process of that. The thing that struck me about New York, I would go in frequently and always have to be finished by the time the last commuter train left for the suburb where I was living, so that meant I wasn't out real late, but I'd get the first couple of sets. Many clubs, probably no more than there are today, actually, but some of the really prominent ones like Birdland, the Five Spot, Basin Street East, the Jazz Gallery, they all had great stuff, and they had often double bills, So I would go in and I'd see, Coltrane would play a set, and then Dizzy Gillespie play a set. I'd go to Birdland and Art Blakey with Lee Morgan, and I think Wayne Shorter at that point would play the first set, and then Maynard Ferguson's big band would come on for the second set. So when I think of this period, I did see Ornette at the Five Spot. I don't know if you want to talk about that now or.
Well, I think it'd be interesting. I mean,
Yeah.
it's such an important thing. It's such an important event, and of course it split critical opinion so much. From the Leonard Bernstein and John Lewis approach that this is a genius that everyone has to go see, to people like Miles and others who expressed the opinion that Ornette was crazy.
Yeah. Well,
He said that, but he kept going back.
Yeah, that was the interesting thing. Yeah.
My buddy and I, John Buchanan from Queens, he came down to visit me, and we went down to the Five Spot. I think we just walked in. We'd been reading. We read Downbeat, and we walked in, and we were just like, what's going on? Because as I said, I'm trying to learn bebop language. I'm trying to learn how to play chord changes, and here's a guy who's playing a new language, and he's not playing the chord changes. And my first reaction is, it's like you're playing baseball, you know, and you look up and there's a guy on second base, but he hasn't batted yet. You know, how did he get there? So, but, yeah, yeah. He, oh, always a baseball fan, yeah.
Red Sox fan.
So this was the group with Don Cherry, Charlie Hayden, Billy Higgins, and I remember the opening group was Randy Weston's trio with Ron Carter. So we were just kind of mesmerized. Certainly didn't get it for sure, and in fact, we went back the next night because we thought, well, it can't be this bad, you know. We have to give it another try. And in the meantime, I went out and I bought The Shape of Jazz to Come, just to show that I'm open-minded. And we went back the second night. And I think the second night, what got us was the energy of it, you know. We might not have agreed with what he was doing with chords and melody and so on, but it swung like crazy. It swung like crazy. And you knew, and I think this is probably what impressed a lot of jazz people, even the people who didn't like it, there was an integrity that shone from it, you know, that you could recognize, even though it wasn't your thing. Billy Higgins, yeah, just, you know, and I mean, there was one of the things I remember was so startling to me was, you know how a band gets up, they talk, and what are we going to do, and they're counting it off and so on. They get up there, and I was looking, there was no count, there was no nothing, and all of a sudden they started playing like that all together. I don't know how they did it, but they did it. That's the kind of thing they did. So it was startling, but the other thing, I don't want to go on too long here, but the other thing that struck me was how many musicians who were still in the bop and post-bop era, how strong they were. I mean, how in 1959, people had come past the era where every saxophone player was trying to play like Bird or Lester Young, every trumpet player was trying to play like Dizzy or Clifford Brown. There were a whole bunch of people who they were in that tradition, but they had their own voices. They had their own voices. You know, Blue Mitchell, Lee Morgan, of the trumpet players, for example, Art Farmer, Benny Golson, people like that. So it was, you know, you never think you're in a golden age when you're in it. You know, we weren't just running around saying, hey, this is 1959, isn't that great? But when you look back on it, you think, well, there were, in addition to all these people that we're talking about now, the giants, the trailblazer, there were all these other people who were playing very, very good music and carrying it forward.
But, you know, I was speculating yesterday on if something in today's world, in music or any other art form, could generate the kind of, you know, sort of must-see excitement that Ornette at the Five Spot would, that, you know, that I think that was a signifier that there was a hole to be filled in 1959, that, you know, the culture was shifting in some ways, and so many people from various walks were interested in going down and checking this out for whatever reason. I mean, people like Elizabeth Taylor went saw Ornette at the Five Spot. So, but the other thing is that today we live in a modern, you know, contemporary electronic world. You know, what happens in New York today is known about around the world pretty quickly, and vice versa. But in 1959, it was a different world, and so, you know, in Europe, in Paris, young man Ron Sweetman is living